Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be back in this community. I was pulled away more than 10 years ago into the policy school, and so now I sort of straddle multiple domains. But the topic of this session, the whole conference, I thought was interesting because agility is a valuable and important component of the supply chain and the value system. But it's also a critical element that I think governments themselves need to start thinking about. One of the concerns I have as a policy scholar is that while the supply chain is becoming more agile and adapting to different changes, the policy community is still chugging along in the old style of we have 5-year deals, we have what I sometimes call the Three Stooges Act, federal, provincial, territorial groups that get stuck in the door negotiating big framework structures. And meanwhile, the world's moving on. And the digital part of the world, I think, is a critically important part. It can be a solution to some problems, or it can be a confounding factor in the policy area. So let me take you through a little bit about where this is. And part of what I wanted to leave with you as a message is that agriculture is not exceptional in this space. We heard that it's one of the least digitally engaged sectors in the U.S. economy, and I think by extension in the Canadian economy. But the questions we're asking in agriculture, we're asking in banking, we're asking in the ICT sector, we're asking in the mobility sector, we're asking in the manufacturing sector. So it's not a unique set of questions, but I think they're lessons that we'll learn across that domain could be quite useful. So there's a big question about the diffusion of the cyber technology, the intensification, particularly in the agri-food space, of the research, production, and supply chain linkages could create a dynamic competitive sector, or it could hollow out and destabilize some of the relationships we have already. And that means that the value capture, our portion of the value capture through the global production network could change dramatically. I also work in the mining space, and in the mining space, you're seeing automated vehicles move into mines in the Pilbara in northern Australia that are actually run 1,400 miles away by some kid with a joystick sitting in a suburban shopping mall in Perth, Australia. If you can do that, you could do it anywhere. So Richard could be, as we saw in one of Jill's observations, Richard could be anywhere in the world running his combine in this kind of a world. That changes where the notion that value is attached to land and attached to the production system that we've come to know. And of course, the thing about digital is that it has a different set of velocities and scales and scopes that could change dramatically the product markets that we're now in. And the basic question that all sectors in Canada are asking is, are we ready? Are we able to take advantage of the opportunities that emerge through this? So let me give you the talk in 5 parts. Talk a little bit about the policy context. I'll talk a little bit about the visions that people are articulating, and we've heard some of them already, and I don't have any problem with the visions, but they're just that. They're visions. There are also some realities. Where are we in that digital transformation that people are talking about? And then that leads to some question about policy challenges, and I think some policy research opportunities that we as scholars and as practitioners may want to consider. So the policy context, it's not just the digital world that's changing. A lot of places are changing, and we're going through a creative period of policy making, not just in Canada, but around the world, as we have a fight between the evidence-based movement that's about objective problems framed through public choice lenses, so we're looking for market failures in places where we can do no harm as we try and address those failures. And we assume, or at least project into that policy space, the notion that we have rational, or at least boundedly rational decision makers with well-ordered preferences, and we get outcomes that fit what we're trained and skilled at doing. There's also a body of literature and a group of the policy community that says, well, that may be what we aspire to, but the reality is we live in an evidence-informed policy space. Evidence is not deterministic. It's one value or one contribution to policy spaces. So what we're ending up with is, instead of objective problems that exist without organization and structure, we're really finding socially constructed, subjective problems that are framed through powerful and compelling causal stories. And citizens like causal stories. So do politicians. So do senior bureaucrats. It's a way of shortening the thought processes. And that these problems and processes, or problems and stories that are created, are then putting through decision systems that are not like the textbook says. We muddle through. Some people even say we have a garbage can model, which is we rummage around and find a problem in one garbage can, and we rummage around and find a solution in another one. And there may be no correlation between the two, but we put them together and say, aha, eureka, I've solved the problem. In that world, we've got an agricultural space that is trying to span that gap. And the digital or cyber agricultural problem is at this point not really engaged in the policy agenda here or anywhere else. It's just currently not there. And so there's some questions about where might it fit. The first place to start is with the visions. The visionaries, the scientists, the entrepreneurs, the financiers, they've got a pretty hyped view of where the digital space will take us. They see it's going well beyond. It will bring agriculture back into the broader socioeconomic and cultural systems that we have. There will be less exceptional space for agriculture to do policy that's unique. But there's a whole range of objectives that not just around digital, but around this innovation space that governments use. We talk about different types of scope, revolutionary, radical, drastic, disruptive, go on. And then we talk about the nature of the innovations themselves. They can be hybrid, they can be macro, they can be general purpose, enabling, transformative. In some ways, the technology we're talking about here probably is transformative. It fits the criteria that Perry Six, a sociologist who changed his name to a number, sort of coined a number of years back. It draws on cutting-edge science and technology. It's not, we still don't know what the dimensions of it are. It's not a one-step change. It's a process of change. It has step changes in the scale and direction of development. Whole sectors or whole parts of the sector could implode or change dramatically. It has consequences that are distributed widely. It's not just on farm or in the local community. It will be scattered widely. It has a high profile. Everybody's digitally connected now. Everybody has their cell phone. Everybody can sort of think that there might be something there that's of interest to them, and they see it either positively or negatively. It is precipitating public debate, not so much yet in the ag space, but it is certainly in other parts. And it offers some prospect for realization. So it's not just thinking out 30 years. It's here and now. It's already embedded in our policy structures and our economic systems. McKinsey's willing to stick its neck out and say how big it might be. I think it was the last year or the year before, came out with a report on the digital revolution, and they said there were 12 technologies that are all digitally based that in total would generate something in the range of $125 trillion within 25, 30 years. That's bigger than the global economy now. So what are they? I won't go through them, but we've heard about cloud, Internet of Things, mobile internet, automation, genomics, autonomous vehicles. Most of them actually have application in agriculture. There are people now applying them into the agricultural and food space. So when I try and think about what the vision is, I see it in sort of three spaces. There's a world that's trying to digitize the research activity. There's a world that says we can make farmers more precise, more profitable, more refined in the way they engage in the production system. And then at the other end of the chain, there's hints that there's something about engaging consumers in a different way, not just through the buyers that Jill talked about in her talk, and not just as consumers, but as engaged parts of the production and consumption system. So let me give you three end games that come together into it. What I hear when I talk to the money people. The first one is that we're going to change the breeding space, and in this case, I've shown the crop one measure of the crop world. We're going to take the genomics data or genomics living matter that's sitting in gene banks. We're going to add omics. We're going to add real-time mechanized machine learning through phenotyping. We're going to put it together with new types of imaging that actually watches things happen in real time at the molecular and submolecular level. And all of that will be wrapped around data analytics. And there's a lot of groups around the world that are trying to put some or all of those pieces together to create what they say might be unlimited, finely designed crops that are just in time for the needs of the biotic and abiotic needs of the economy. The second end game is the on-farm stuff. It's the scripting, it's the capture, management, and delivery of knowledge out of the data that's generated in the production space that has territorial connections. The promise, when the early scripters came out and were doing some of the work, they said we can script a field and increase yields 6-7% with no change in inputs. Now, 6 to 7%, that's like your gross margin on some crops, some of the commodity crops. So that's 100% improvement on gross margin. So that was the kind of value proposition the early people were having. But ultimately, when I listened to some of the people in Climate Corp and in some of the larger companies, they're thinking that every field and every subfield will become a field trial. That the real-time data you're producing as farmers find pockets of high productivity and pockets of low productivity, they will be investigating to optimize every 10 meter by 10 meter space. So that's sort of the visions that people have articulated. And the third one, which is just sort of out there but quiet, is this notion that somehow there's a possibility of creating just right foods. That consumers can not just be buyers, but can actually specify and be part of the production choice set. And so that it's not just off the shelf, but designed to demand. And one of the futurists, Charles Ledbetter, talks about where we've seen this in other parts of the world. The mountain bike was a product of a bunch of consumers who said, nobody's producing what I need to go on these hills. Same with snowboards, same with a whole variety of things. You're seeing that introgressing into a whole variety of service industries as consumers are actually not just buying off a menu, but they're constructing the menu from which they'll consume and use. So at the end point, you might end up with the restaurant at the end of the universe model from Hitchhiker's Guide, where your food has a conversation with you. In this case, that ugly cow-like thing. So the notion that consumers, at the extreme level, most of us are too busy to have this, but some consumers say they want to have an engaged, real-time, two-way, morally grounded conversation with their food. Not just through proxies, but personally and individually. So the Utopian Dream is a mix of differentiated technologies that optimally deliver novelty to farmers who precisely use it and optimize every input, capital good, piece of land, and input of labor, and that they're linked in real time, not ex post, in real time, to the consumers who are no longer simply buyers but co-inventors. And at the end of the day, there's a whole bunch of new value generators, integrators, value deliverers who will sort of drive out all the inefficiencies in the market. I mean, this is the vision. And so waste goes away. We now are using everything. It contributes to all the socioeconomic measures that people want out of the market. That's a utopian dream. One thing we know about these kinds of technologies is they never go where people want them to go. They go where they can fit and add value immediately. So we're not going to get there in any realistic way. But people have guesstimated value, and the biggest value is the stuff we haven't even figured out. I mean, there could be some value in research, there could be some value for equipment makers, there could be some value in this analytics space and sensing, but the real value is when all of that starts to get together. So that total factor productivity element, which agriculture's been pretty good at delivering, much better than most sectors in the Canadian economy. So this is a real opportunity space. But the question is, how do we liberate that value into Canadian or agricultural hands rather than have it migrate geographically? So let's talk about some of the realities. We've had some progress, but most of the applications are really in development stage. Few of them have proof of concept or a clear commercialization pathway. Some of the talks in the last section were great because they talked about all the profusion of different platforms and deliverers, and that's like any new industry. The auto industry had 6,000 different firms dueling to become the auto industry, of which 5 or 6 survived. Same when we had the opening of the internet. Thousands of candidates to be the Google, one Google. So this is a highly contested space. There's a lot of investment. It comes and goes. It's lumpy. And there's a lot of interest. There are value propositions, but they're not particularly demonstrated, and we are going to have a shakeout. And it won't be just one shakeout. It'll be a succession of creatively destroyed candidates that move into this market, both existing value generators and new value generators. There's a couple of macro views. Canada's not badly spaced. We have high GDP, and we're relatively well digitized as an economy. That's a good thing. The point about digital investment writ large is that generally it's not just about efficiency. It's not just about those narrow precision questions. It's about variety. It's about process improvement. It's about a whole mix of technologies, data, and analytics that mix together. So let me go back to those three end games. The first one is that we create a breeding research system that actually moves away from dirt and the old style, almost bespoke, artisanal breeding space. We still have a lot of that. I mean, it's highly sophisticated and highly effective, but the model they're using they're offering is a machine-learned environment. We've had some successes. There are people who came up with the virtual cell, the virtual plant, and then the virtual lab for plant development at Wageningen. And there are lots of aspirants in this area. My university is one of them. We got a Canada First Excellence Research Grant called P2IRC, which I don't think any of us can remember what the acronym stands for, but essentially it's machine learning, putting together imaging, mechanized phenotyping with genomics and the other omics, and using data analytics to try and accelerate and refine the breeding space. There are international consortia. DivSeek is sort of the apex. It's a collaboration through the Global Crop Diversity Trust. It's the apex, but I think there are something like 85 different commodity plant space groups that are all trying to put together some or all of those elements. And the biggest problem is that they don't talk to each other. They're spending most of their time talking about ontologies, figuring out what is yellow, how do you measure the height of a plant, how do you define the shape of a leaf. It seems kind of obvious to those of us who don't deal in this space, but everybody has their own personalized style of gathering and capturing data, and there's no way of putting it all together. There's no way of extracting the value that may already exist in many of these structures. And then there are a lot of corporate efforts. I've been down to Monsanto's effort. They've got some that they're just actually moving out of, so they see this as an older generation technologies in some ways, but they bought Climate Corp. They're investing heavily in mechanizing at least components of their breeding space. Their seed chippers, their automated phenotyping in their greenhouses is quite impressive. It puts most of the public investments to shame in terms of scale, scope, and direction. So the bottom line is that we have a model. It's still under development. There's no proof of concept yet. We don't know whether it'll work, but there's a lot of money chasing it. Hundreds of millions of dollars in various countries around the world. The second end game is the one that we tend to spend a lot of time on in the agri-food space, and I'll spend a little bit of time talking about what I see as the realities there. But precision agriculture is one of the main investment spaces. The Ag Funder, organization which tries to gather all the investment data from North America and around the world, shows that there's probably been around 500 startups in 2015 that raised about $4 to $5 billion. Precision ag was about 15-20% of that. USA, as one would expect, is the main target. India is number 2. Canada is number 3. So we're in the space, but we're a small player compared to the world. And so a lot of what we may be presented with is not going to come designed for our space. It's going to come and have to be adapted and adopted to our interests. And digitizing is the perception is that it has potential and is starting to create new supply, new markets, new demands through a variety of different elements, many of which we've talked about already, so I won't belabor them. What's important, I think, to understand is that there is an industrial space that's engaged with the application of digital technologies in agriculture. And it's coming from a variety of areas. And so just to try and get a handle on the nature of what's coming down the stream, we looked across the Canadian and American landscape and looked to see who's organizing it and under what core principles are they using. Is this a top-down trying to version out from an existing capital stock, or is this an entrepreneurial bottom-up startup type structure? So we differentiated between top-down, bottom-up, and then we differentiated based on whether they're open or closed. Whether the idea is that this is going to be a wrap system, you buy it, your data gets gathered and vanishes into some proprietary envelope, and you get it back in a proprietary way, and it's not interoperable with other sources of data. And so we can see illustrative examples in all of those. There are large multinationals in the type 1 space, the corporate model. There are some enterprises that are trying to create strategic networks that are open and allow for interoperability across different platforms. There are what I call the hacked world, the app hack space, the perfectly competitive world. There's a lot of people producing apps, and that was pointed out. Nobody wants to fund those anymore because there's just too many of them. And then there's some of these bottom-up closed systems. They're a bit primordial. They're mostly club-like systems that are emerging, and there are actors in each. So let me just quickly go through the 4 spaces that we face. I mean, John Deere, these things change as we talk about them and as we study them. Deere's initial model was very closed, very top-down, limited operability. They'll sell you a package. They'll actually gather the information through the various machinery that you have. They'll put it together. They'll provide you a platform that translates their advice from not only your farm data, but from the larger data sets that they have. And it was proprietary. The idea was that you had to buy in, and once you're in, it's very hard to move across. You have a lock-in built into that system. And their big play for control was they had machinery everywhere. And much of it was already digitally enabled, if not digitally turned on. So they were using that. They were trying to version off their capital platform. And they've opened up a little bit that it's not as closed as it was initially planned because some people weren't willing to buy in at the price. Monsanto and Climate Corp are doing the same kind of thing. But the reality is that they're not really at the level of specificity that they were talking about. We talked to the algorithm creator at Climate Corp late last year, and he said, our goal is 10 meter by 10 meter plots. We're dealing with fields, and we're only passing a satellite over you once every 2 weeks. So this isn't real time. This is snapshots in time, and they're getting some value out of that, but it's certainly not anywhere near what the vision that they've been selling to the producers is. The second one is a top-down, more open system. An example of that is Farm Mobile. They sell a package of technology. They then incentivize the participants to use their process for entering data. So you get this PUC, you put it on a tractor, you attach antennas and cables, you turn on your phone, and you're good to go. It starts gathering data. There's a fixed cost for putting it in, but you actually get some money back. As you put it in, they value and pass some money back, but they don't really do much. A lot of big data analytics. They're expecting that you and others will then add to that platform and create value out of the data that's been captured and that they partly analyzed. A third model is the bottom-up open. I mean, this is in Saskatchewan. We started doing an ICT strategy, and they had big ideas that they were going to get into all kinds of apps and other things. And when they actually got down to it, they found there were about 300 people building apps, but they were all for agriculture. It was farm kids, urban kids. Some of them were actually farm kids. That was good. And they saw a need, and they were building an app. Some of them are playing. In this case, this is an app plus. Somebody's playing around with drones. They'll take pictures at all different kinds of intensification of infrared and others, and they'll provide you with a diagnostic report. It's an open process, but it's not connected to anybody. This is a one-off, tiny little opportunity, and there's lots of those out there. Everybody wants to be in that space. And then there's a few that are greenfield entrepreneurial ones. Many of them come out of the financing or market watching consultancies that see that people don't want to go with the big multinationals. They want to go with someone that's more local and that has worked with them in the past. And so they're actually building what the large companies already have. They don't have a built capital base, but they're trying to build a whole series of technological links that create that capture the data that they then can provide some analytics on. And they would like ultimately to be in a closed system. They want to optimize and create local locked-in monopolies. So maybe not at the scale of Deere, but at a smaller scale. And there's a whole series of companies like FarmLead and others. So what are some early observations about where we're at? There are top-down driven innovation spaces. They're leveraging digital technologies from other sectors in other countries. And there's a really strong focus on exploiting not the data. Nobody owns data. Data cannot be owned, but the meaning around data can be owned. All the value that's generated from that data point can be owned, can generate significant value, and so they're using a property rights strategy to optimize for them. The producer or bottom-up driven innovations groups are more driven by people who have some know-how. They have some networks. They have what they think is some trusted links that they can then exploit and use to create a commercial operation. And in the self-declared asset they have is they have legitimacy because they're closer to the customer. Now, I'm just reporting what we hear out in the countryside. I'm not sure it's as valuable as they say. A lot of it's programmer or development driven, and a lot of it's based on skills that were acquired right on farm. So it's not VenCap startups. These are bootstrapped ventures that are out there. There are these networks that are coming, and a lot of them are trying to build on the human relationships that they have already. Generally, there's a weaker focus to the bottom-up led initiatives. There's an interest in property rights, but it's not the only thing. They see that nimble and quick business adaptation, the agility that will come from the digital space is where they'll get their value. Most of the digital space has intellectual property, but it's slower than the market. I mean, they're in and out in 18 to 24 months, and most IP, if you're applying proactively for IP rights, take 2 to 3 years to prosecute and acquire. So you're out of the market before you've actually got the intellectual property right to exploit. So they're exploiting market position and lock-in and other things. So that's the commercial reality. The flip side is, where's the farm sector? Are they ready for the opportunities that are coming out there? And there's some good news and bad news there, I think. If we look at spending on information communication technologies, there are some StatScan data. It's not great, but you can see the top line is the private sector across the whole national economy, and then you can see the ag production network sectors. The R&D space, the chemical space, the machinery and equipment space, and insurance and related services, all are pretty good investors. They're above average investors in ICT, software, websites, data processing, database services. So they're well positioned. They're intensively using the technology. And down at the bottom, you can see food manufacturers are sort of a bit of both. The part that is perhaps more concerning is that the part that's more wrapped around the farmer, the management consulting part, the agriculture part, the securities and commodity parts, the wholesale distribution system, and the truck transportation are all under investing in ICT. So in one way, we're playing a little bit of catch up in some critical spaces that will determine whether the value is captured on farm or captured further away. Because in some of these areas, there are leading actors in different parts of the world that are making the investment, and if it's not geographically locked down, it can move wherever you want it, wherever it gets started first. The second question is agriculture, using the technology it's investing in, and I'm not going to go through it, but you can sort of see the private sector in aggregate is the second from the right columns, yeah, right, and the agriculture and food, forestry and other hunting, I think it is. So agriculture is the main one there. Most of it is underutilized. So they may be using it, but it doesn't matter whether it's small farm, large operator. We're underutilizing the opportunities in terms of hardware, software, and systems. So what's the barrier? Why are we not using some of these things? Why are we not investing? And if we're investing, why are we not using them in the way other parts of the economy are using? Remember, we're near the top end of that digital intensified economic space that the world is moving towards. It's not cost. That's not the issue. It's really in areas of employee resistance, technical expertise, and compatibility between old and new systems. And of course, the issue that we've raised a couple of times, which is security and privacy concerns of data. Even farmers I know that are investing very heavily in this say, I want to know who's using my data, and I want to control who uses my data. And I want the option of withdrawing, just as we have as scholars from or as we face as scholars, from the use of the data by others. It's not a value proposition space problem, which is rather interesting because the value proposition is pretty tenuous at this point. But right now, the producers in that bundled Ag Plus space are saying that they mostly have enough evidence to make some choices, but there are other barriers that are slowing down their use. So what does this mean from the policy perspective? I want to back away a little bit from agriculture because I think it's important to realize that the ICT space is a complicated policy space, even without adding the complexities of agriculture in a federal, provincial, territorial policy system. The Canadian policy system differentially is weak and has been incapable of dealing with ICT. And that's not a new thing. We've tried. I mean, the STI policy generally, across all science, technologies, and innovation, biotech, advanced materials, instrumentation, doesn't matter. The STI space is not a priority for governments, except rhetorically. I mean, when you look at rhetoric and realities and actions, it just doesn't translate. And Bruce Dern, David Castle, and I did a 50-year study of science policy in Canada. And you can see that the ministers don't matter. They're usually third-rate ministers who are on their way out or just trying to get their toehold in cabinet. The deputies come and go. The superstructure of policy actors changes almost as fast as the technologies themselves. So there's no real-time connection between the actors and the problems. The digital policy space has even been worse. I mean, it's usually been too little, too late. The market's blown past what they were talking about. We've had, I think, 6 or 7 attempts to do various parts of the digital future for Canada, and I think we've got another one right now. Canada 150 is going to be partly a digital play. But by the time they get it out, whatever they're talking about will have already moved on. It'll be old news. Their ability to influence what happens and where it happens will be limited. And the other problem is that science, technology, and innovation and the digital thinkers on this are stovepiped. They're isolated over in Industry Canada. There may be some people in agriculture working on it, but they're not normally able to access the competence and the capacity and the insights that come from that larger group. I mean, they're solitudes. So what does that tell us about this policy space? I mean, I think there's a couple of different points I want to make. One is that there's data points everywhere, but they're not organized in any way that those in the supply chain have been able to demonstrably generate value from. But more importantly, there's not a lot of data that we as policy advisors and policy analysts can use. We just don't know what the scale, scope, and shape of this is. I mean, we're scratching the surface. The USDA is just finishing a survey, I understand, right now, but it's a relatively small survey. Our census only has a few basic questions of different types of technology we use. Ag Canada is busy funding some surveys right now, but they're catch-as-catch-can surveys. And all of them, whether they're formal or informal, are often just partial snippets of what the digital space looks like around agriculture. So we have a policy problem at its root, But then there's some particular issues that fit within that sort of cloak of ignorance that we have. There's the big policy question that provinces and national governments in Canada and beyond are talking about is what's the location of value? Where does it go geographically? Where does it go in terms of the value chain? You know, do we just reduce the percentage of on-farm value as we add one more input that's produced off-farm, or is this going to change things? And I think this is where, as scholars and policy advisors, we probably need to put away, as I think it was Sexton's quote right in the first talk, we've got to put away our perfectly competitive models and start thinking about some of the models that other sectors have been using. So Shapiro and Varian did a wonderful, very accessible book about the networked economy, and you know, they took their lessons from the fight over the Department of Justice antitrust on Google, and they talk about the importance of path dependence in these technological spaces, where there's technological lock-in and network effects that are the story. They're not. They don't represent standard normal distributions of inputs or outputs. They're very lumpy. They're very power log like, so they're hard to deal with. So I think there's a methodological question we need to start thinking about. Similarly, there's a lot of work that I think can and should be done to look very explicitly around the corporate mergers and acquisitions. The fact that there's money moving around says that somebody thinks there's value out there, and tracking it, much as some of us did when biotech first started up, tracking who's buying who and how they're putting them together and spinning them out again, could tell us a lot about the location of value. The big question on the mind of most people and on the minds of most of the commercial actors is who's going to own and control the data. That is a policy window that governments actually have some ability to move into. The other two we can observe on and try and bend against the wind, but the property rights and regulatory structures for management of data is within the public space. As I said, no one owns the data, but everyone can exploit the meaning of that data through a variety of ways. And this is one area where agricultural exceptionalism may actually work. I think generally we're going to lose the exceptional nature of agriculture, but this is one that might. And the American Farm Bureau has sort of launched into this space. Some Canadians think that we should be doing something similar, but they signed, along with 30 different organizations and firms, a privacy and security principles for farm data, which has a whole variety of ones about ownership, collection, control, transparency, choice, the disclosure, prior disclosure, data retention and availability, up to and including termination of the relationship, and then the big concerns about who can use this data. Can this be used by regulators to find you in non-compliance for some of the regulatory elements? And will it generate new liability and security concerns for the individual operators? So there is an exceptional model that's starting to work, and this would not happen in other spaces, but it has happened in the American Farm Bureau, and it probably will set a benchmark for others. So most of us either are part of the policy space, advising policymakers, or doing research that may influence policymakers. So I thought I'd try and end on a note about what do I think this tells us about the type of research and the type of questions and methods we have to use to find greater insight in this area of digital agriculture. One lesson we're learning everywhere else but agriculture is that digital applications lead to non-standard normal distributions. You get power log phenomena. Somebody wins a lot, but there's too many people at the other end. It doesn't have a nice bell curve, which means that most of the models and methods we use that assume the Gaussian distribution will probably lead to biased and inconsistent results. So we have to start looking for new tools. First, we have to test, is that true? I mean, don't just accept we're living in a power-logged, long-tail world. Actually go out and test it, and there are tests for that. We can do leptokurtosis and a whole variety of other tests to figure out what does the distributional effect look like. That's the starting point. If it is standard normal, if it's standard normal, great. If it's not, we need to use some new tools. And the new tools are things like actually mapping the structure of the network systems that are out there. Don't assume a supply chain look to see if it's actually a network or whether it has the linear supply chain elements. And there's a whole set of network analysis tools that exist that many of you and I have used. There's the question about the dynamic nature. These aren't static events anymore. These are highly dynamic. There's potential that in many cases the agent-based modeling tools could be very helpful in understanding how these systems will evolve and move. But agent-based modeling, in absence of reality, leads to interesting stories, but not necessarily useful advice. So these need to be validated by surveys, case studies, and a whole series of experiments and other quantitative and qualitative tools, some of which we're very comfortable using. And finally, I think one of the things that comes out of these spaces of transformative change, where uncertainty is a core to most decision-making, is that we can't assume rationality anymore. We have to start thinking about the behavioral or the underlying cognitive structures. So are we being pushed by uncertainty into prospect theory? Being pushed for and against, towards and against different kinds of gains and losses depending on the starting point. Are we influenced by framing devices, these causal stories, these powerful visions people are creating? That may force us to, or push us to take more risk, or may make us risk averse. And finally, there's a whole series of cognitive biases and heuristics, and Jill talked about some of them, and I know some of the others talked about them, some of the papers talked about them, but those are all testable. We can and should be using the advanced tools that we have from economics and from other disciplines to test for whether the digital space has actually changed the nature of what we're trying to study. So let me leave with you a couple of quick conclusions. There's a lot of excitement out there, and it is translating into activity, but the activity isn't necessarily generating downstream value yet. The pathways to success are unclear, and I think we're going to see a series of rolling shakeouts as different parts of this digital landscape shift one way or the other. I think the Canadian agri-food sector is reasonably well positioned. We have a rising market share. We have the highest MFP, not MPF, multi-factor productivity relative to the rest of the other sectors in Canada. But the global landscape is changing, so we can't just say, well, we've always been successful, so we'll be successful in this new space. The firms and farms are preparing, but they may need to focus more on actually generating some cash flow and value out of the investments that are there. And the bottom line is, if Canada fails to secure a role in this space, much of the value can and will migrate from farming in Canada or from Canada itself as it moves to wherever the path-dependent development has led it to. And I guess, that sounds like I know where we're going. What I do know is that in the transformative space, people at this stage of a transformation are usually going to be totally wrong. We have to at least be aware of that one solid conclusion when you deal with transformative technology is that they always play out differently than we expect. So thank you very much.